My stepmother sold my mother's family heirloom to buy a BMW. The buyer just exposed her secret. My stepmother Lindsay married my dad exactly 1 year after my mother died of cancer. Mom had started suspecting an affair during her final months. Now I know why. Lindsay's first demand when she moved in: remove every photo of Mom from the house, including my bedroom. Dad sided with her. I moved Mom's pictures to my bathroom, the only space Lindsay couldn't control. She threw out Mom's recipes, donated her books, painted over the wall where Mom measured my height every birthday. She banned us from mentioning Mom's name. "It makes me uncomfortable," she'd say. "I'm your family now." Last month, my maternal grandmother gave me something sacred: Mom's watch. A family heirloom passed from mother to daughter for 6 generations, worth about $30,000. It should have gone to Mom, but since she died, it came to me. "Where did you get that?" Lindsay asked at dinner, her eyes locked on the watch. "It's a family heirloom, from my mom's side. I'll give you $1,000 for it. It's not for sale." 2,000. 3. 7,500. I said no. "You're an idiot, holding on to some old watch when you could have money. You just want to erase my mother." Dad stayed silent. Lindsay smiled coldly. "I'll have that watch one way or another." For weeks, nothing happened. I kept the watch in my jewelry box, checking on it daily. Then 3 days ago, I came home to find a brand new BMW in our driveway. "Whose car?" I asked Dad. "Lindsay bought it." That evening, I went to wear the watch. It was gone. I searched everywhere, then confronted them. "You stole it." "That's ridiculous," Lindsay started. "Where's my watch?" Dad cracked first. "She needed a car." "Her car works fine," Lindsay exploded. "I sold it because I don't want you bonded to that woman. She's dead. I'm your mother now." "You'll never be my mother." They haven't spoken to me in 3 days. But I found out who bought the watch: Lindsay's father, a collector. He seemed nice the one time we met. I'm planning to contact him. But first, revenge. Tonight, my friends and I were going to destroy her BMW. Eggs, feathers, honey, maybe slash the tires. Childish? Yes. Satisfying? Absolutely. But this morning, everything changed. I was searching Lindsay's office for the bill of sale when I found something else. Medical records. Not Mom's, Lindsay's. She'd been a patient at the same cancer center as Mom. Same doctor. Overlapping treatment dates. The timeline made my stomach drop. Lindsay wasn't having an affair with Dad. She was Mom's chemo friend. They were in treatment together, same days, same times. There were even notes from a support group they both attended. But here's what made my blood run cold. Lindsay's cancer went into remission 2 weeks before Mom died. The doctor's notes mentioned survivor's guilt and complicated grief over fellow patients' decline. I kept reading. Found emails between Lindsay and Mom. Mom was actually encouraging Lindsay to look after Dad and me. "If something happens to me," Mom wrote, "promise you'll make sure they're okay." Lindsay had promised. There was more. Lindsay's first husband had died 5 years ago. Cancer. She'd nursed him through the same disease that killed Mom. Her emails to Mom talked about how watching another spouse deteriorate was triggering her PTSD. The last email from Mom, sent 3 days before she died: "I know you understand loss. If Paul moves on with someone, I hope it's someone like you. Someone who knows how precious time is." I felt sick. But I kept searching. Found the receipt for the watch. She'd sold it to her father for $31,000. But there was another document. A savings account in my name. $31,000 deposited 3 days ago. The exact amount from the watch. She hadn't spent it on the car. She'd saved it for me. There was a note in her handwriting. "For Hannah's college. She'll hate me now, but maybe understand later." The watch was beautiful, but her mother would want her education funded. I'll be the villain so Paul doesn't have to be. I found one more thing. A safety deposit box key with a tag. "Hannah, open when you're ready to forgive me." I drove to the bank. Inside the box was another watch. Almost identical to Mom's heirloom, but newer. And a letter from Lindsay. "I had a replica made before selling the original. It's not the same, I know. But I was terminal when I met your mother. She saved my life, literally. Convinced me to try experimental treatment. I lived, she didn't. I owe her everything. Selling the watch was wrong, but I couldn't watch Paul struggle to pay for your college while wearing something worth your entire tuition. Your mom would understand. She always chose practicality over sentiment. But I saved every photo I made him remove. Every recipe I threw out. They're in storage unit 47B. The key is taped under your mother's grave marker. I'm sorry for everything, but I promised her I'd take care of you both, even if you hate me for it." I stood there holding the replica watch, my revenge plans crumbling. Then my phone rang. Dad. "Hannah, come home now. Lindsay collapsed. The cancer's back. Stage 4. She's asking for you." I stood in the hospital parking lot with my phone in my hand, staring at Dad's text that Lindsay collapsed and the cancer was back. My friends were waiting at my house with eggs and supplies to destroy her car, and I needed to tell them the plan was off. Everything I thought I knew about Lindsay just got turned completely upside down. The replica watch felt heavy in my jacket pocket, pressing against my ribs with every breath. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Mila's number, my thumb hovering over the call button. The bank's safety deposit box letter sat folded in my other pocket, Lindsay's handwriting burning through the paper into my skin. Stage 4, Dad's text said. Stage 4 meant bad. Really bad. I pressed call and put the phone to my ear, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few scattered cars and an ambulance parked near the emergency entrance. I could see people moving behind the lit windows of the hospital, going about their business like my entire world wasn't falling apart. Mila picked up on the 4th ring and I heard voices in the background. Probably Austin and the others already at my house. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. She asked if I was okay, and I finally managed to tell her to leave, that I found something and couldn't go through with the revenge. She asked what I found, but I couldn't explain it over the phone because I was still trying to process it myself. The words stuck in my throat like broken glass. How do you tell someone that the person you've hated for a year was actually trying to keep a promise to your dead mother? That every cruel thing she did came from a place of trauma, so deep it made her lash out instead of reaching out? Mila kept asking questions, but I just told her I had to go, that I'd explain everything later. I hung up before she could argue and stood there for another minute, trying to make my legs work. I drove to the hospital in a daze, the replica watch heavy in my jacket pocket. The streets blurred past my windows and I barely registered the turns I was making. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I kept seeing Lindsay's note in my head. The part about being the villain so Dad didn't have to be. I kept seeing Mom's emails encouraging Lindsay to look after us. The storage unit key taped under Mom's grave marker. Every photo Lindsay claimed to throw out, carefully saved. The college fund with the exact amount from the watch sale. My brain couldn't make it all fit together with the woman who banned Mom's name from our house. The parking garage was dim and smelled like oil and exhaust. I found a spot on the 3rd level and sat in my car for a few minutes. Engine off, just breathing. The hospital loomed through my windshield, all lit windows and clean white walls. Somewhere in there, Lindsay was lying in a bed, her cancer back after years of remission. Stage 4. I pulled the replica watch out of my pocket and looked at it under the dome light. It really did look almost identical to Mom's original, down to the tiny scratch on the crystal face. Lindsay had spent weeks finding someone to make it. She'd had it made before selling the original because she couldn't stand the thought of me having nothing of Mom's to wear. I put it on my wrist and it felt right even though it wasn't the original. I finally got out of the car and walked toward the elevators, each step feeling like I was walking through water. When I arrived at the hospital, Dad was in the waiting room looking 10 years older than he did this morning. His hair stuck up in weird directions like he'd been running his hands through it. His shirt was wrinkled and untucked on one side. He had dark circles under his eyes that I'd never noticed before. He stood up when he saw me and tried to hug me, but I stepped back because I was still angry at him for lying about everything. He let his arms drop and his face crumpled for just a second before he pulled himself together. He told me Lindsay was stable, but asking for me specifically. His voice cracked on the word stable like he didn't really believe it. I asked what happened and he explained that she'd been feeling off all morning, tired and dizzy, but insisted she was fine. Then she collapsed in the kitchen while making lunch. He'd called the ambulance and they'd run tests and found tumors in her liver and lungs. I felt my stomach drop even though I'd already known from his text. Hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way the text message hadn't. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away, still not ready to forgive him for letting me think Lindsay was a monster when he knew the truth. He flinched like I'd hit him, but nodded, understanding. He asked if I wanted to see her, and I said yes, even though I wasn't sure what I was going to say when I got there. He led me down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and floor cleaner, past nurses' stations and other rooms with closed doors. We stopped outside room 347, and he put his hand on the door handle, then looked at me one more time to make sure I was ready. I walked into Lindsay's hospital room, and she looked so small in the bed, nothing like the intimidating woman who'd been controlling our house for a year. She had an IV in her arm and monitors beeping softly beside her. Her face was pale and drawn, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was wearing a hospital gown that made her look fragile and human in a way I'd never seen before. She saw me and started crying, saying she knew I found everything and she was sorry. The words tumbled out of her between sobs. I sat down in the chair next to her bed because my legs wouldn't hold me up anymore. The chair was one of those uncomfortable plastic ones that hospitals have everywhere. I could hear Dad hovering in the doorway behind me, but I didn't turn around. Lindsay kept crying and apologizing, saying she never meant for things to go this way. She said she knew I'd been in her office, that she'd left the safety deposit box key where I'd find it because she couldn't keep lying anymore. She said the cancer coming back felt like punishment for how badly she'd handled everything. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there watching her cry. Part of me wanted to yell at her for everything she'd put me through. Part of me wanted to comfort her because she looked so broken. Part of me just wanted to run away and pretend this wasn't happening. The replica watch felt heavy on my wrist, a constant reminder of everything I'd learned in the past few hours. Lindsay told me she never meant to be cruel, but watching me grieve reminded her so much of her own loss that she couldn't handle it. Her voice was rough from crying, and she kept wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. She said she thought removing Mom's things would help us all move forward, but she realized now it was her own trauma talking. She explained how her first husband had died slowly over 2 years, how she'd watched cancer eat away at him piece by piece. When she met Mom at the cancer center and they became friends, it triggered everything she'd tried to bury. She said watching Mom decline brought back every nightmare from losing her husband. She said Mom was the bravest person she ever met, and she'd been terrified of failing her promise to look after me and Dad. She told me about the support group they'd attended together, how Mom had convinced her to try experimental treatment when Lindsay was ready to give up. She said Mom saved her life, literally talked her into living when she'd been ready to die. And then Mom died while Lindsay lived, and the guilt nearly destroyed her. She said every time she looked at me, she saw Mom, and every time she saw Mom, she remembered that she was alive while Mom wasn't. So she tried to erase the reminders, thinking it would help everyone heal faster. She said she knew now how wrong that was, how cruel it must have seemed. She said she'd been seeing a therapist for PTSD, but stopped going because she thought she was better. She admitted she was never better, just better at hiding it. I asked Lindsay why she didn't just tell me the truth from the beginning, and she admitted she was ashamed of being so broken that she couldn't be the stepmother Mom wanted her to be. She said every time she looked at me, she saw Mom dying all over again. I started crying too because I understood that kind of grief even though I was still angry about how she handled it. Tears ran down my face and I didn't bother wiping them away. She reached for my hand and I let her take it this time, her fingers cold and thin in mine. She said she'd wanted to be strong for me, to be the person Mom asked her to be, but she was too damaged from her own losses. She said she thought if she could just remove all the reminders of death and sickness, we could all pretend to be a normal family. She said she knew how stupid that sounded now, how impossible. She told me about the panic attacks she'd had in the first months after marrying Dad, how she'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced she was back in the hospital watching her first husband die. She said Dad knew about her PTSD, but they'd both agreed not to tell me because they didn't want me to worry. She said that was another mistake in a long line of mistakes. I told her I wished she'd just been honest, that I could have handled the truth better than the lies. She nodded and said she knew that now, but fear had made her stupid. She squeezed my hand and said she understood if I couldn't forgive her, but she wanted me to know that everything she did came from love, even if it came out all wrong. Dr. Owens came in to discuss Lindsay's prognosis and asked if I wanted to stay for the conversation. He was tall with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Lindsay grabbed my hand and asked me to stay, and I did, even though part of me wanted to run away. Dad moved further into the room and stood on Lindsay's other side, his hand on her shoulder. The doctor pulled up a chair and sat down, holding a tablet with test results on it. He explained the cancer had spread to her liver and lungs, and they were looking at treatment options, but the outlook was serious. He used words like aggressive and metastatic and treatment-resistant. He said the cancer had likely been growing for months, maybe longer, and they'd need to do more tests to determine the full extent. He talked about chemotherapy options and clinical trials and quality-of-life considerations. Lindsay asked him directly how much time she had, and he said it was hard to say. Maybe months, maybe a year with aggressive treatment, maybe less. The room felt like all the air had been sucked out of it. Dad made a choking sound and Lindsay squeezed both our hands. The doctor said they'd start running more comprehensive tests tomorrow and put together a treatment plan based on the results. He said there were still options, still things they could try. His voice was gentle, but I could hear the reality underneath his words. This was bad. This was really, really bad. He asked if we had any questions, and none of us could think of anything to say. He told us to take our time and left, closing the door softly behind him. After the doctor left, I showed Lindsay the replica watch she had made. I held up my wrist so she could see it in the fluorescent hospital lights. She touched it gently and told me she spent weeks finding a craftsman who could match it perfectly because she couldn't stand the thought of me having nothing of Mom's to wear. Her fingers traced the edge of the watch face, the same way I'd seen her touch things that belonged to her first husband. She said she'd taken dozens of photos of the original from every angle, measurements and close-ups of every detail. She'd found a jeweler 3 towns over who specialized in replica work and paid him extra to rush the job. She said she'd picked it up the day before she sold the original to her father, and she'd cried in her car in the jeweler's parking lot holding both watches, knowing she was about to break my heart. She said she'd written that letter to me a dozen times, trying to explain, but every version sounded like excuses. She said she'd hoped I'd find everything after I went to college, when I had some distance and perspective. She never expected to collapse before then. She never expected to have to face me with the truth so soon. I put it on my wrist and it felt right even though it wasn't the original. I told her thank you and she started crying again, saying she didn't deserve my thanks. I didn't know if she did or didn't, but I said it anyway because it felt like the right thing to do in that moment. Dad finally came into the room and the 3 of us sat in uncomfortable silence for a while. He stood at the foot of Lindsay's bed, hands in his pockets, looking everywhere except at us. The monitors beeped steadily and voices passed in the hallway outside. I could hear a TV playing in another room, some game show with canned laughter. I broke it by asking him why he let me think Lindsay was a monster when he knew the truth about everything. My voice came out harder than I meant it to, but I didn't take it back. He admitted he was a coward who couldn't face his own grief, so he let Lindsay take all the blame for decisions they made together. He said it was easier to let her be the bad guy than to have hard conversations with me about why they were doing what they were doing. He said he knew it was wrong, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. He said after Mom died, he felt like he was drowning, and Lindsay was the only solid thing he could hold on to. He said they'd made a plan together to remove Mom's things gradually, thinking it would help everyone heal, but he'd let Lindsay take all the heat when I got angry. He said he should have stood up for her, should have explained, should have been honest. He said he was sorry, and he knew sorry wasn't enough. He looked at me finally, and I saw real regret in his eyes. I wanted to stay angry at him, but I was too tired. I told him he needed to do better, and he nodded, saying he would try. I told them both that I needed time to process everything, but I wasn't going to abandon Lindsay while she was sick. The words surprised me as I said them, but I meant them. I explained that I found the letter and the college fund and the storage unit key, and I needed to see Mom's things that Lindsay saved. Lindsay gave me the exact address of the storage facility and the unit number, 47B, at the facility on Maple Street near the old grocery store. She said the unit was climate-controlled and she'd packed everything carefully in labeled boxes. She said there were photos and recipes and books and the wall measurements and everything else she'd claimed to throw away. She said she'd been planning to give me the key on my 18th birthday, but then everything got so complicated and angry between us that she'd chickened out. She said she'd put the key under Mom's grave marker because she knew I'd eventually go there and maybe find it when I was ready. I asked if I could go tomorrow, and she said yes. Said she'd feel better knowing I had Mom's things back. Dad said he'd go with me if I wanted, but I told him I needed to do this alone first. He looked hurt, but nodded. Lindsay asked if I'd come back tomorrow after I went to the storage unit, and I said I would. I stood up to leave, and Lindsay grabbed my hand one more time, telling me she loved me even if she'd done a terrible job of showing it. I didn't say it back, but I squeezed her hand before letting go. I left the hospital around 9 and drove straight to the cemetery even though it was getting dark. The gate was still open, and I parked near Mom's section, grabbing my phone for the flashlight. Her grave marker looked different at night, smaller somehow, and I knelt down beside it, running my fingers along the edges. The key was exactly where Lindsay said it would be, taped to the underside in a small plastic bag. I pulled it free and sat back on the grass, holding it in my palm like it might disappear. The cemetery was quiet except for wind in the trees and distant traffic sounds. I started talking to Mom out loud, telling her about finding the medical records and the college fund and Lindsay's letter. I asked her if she really wanted this for us, if she knew how hard it would be. I told her I was angry at her for leaving and for making promises with Lindsay that I had to live with now. I told her I missed her. So much it felt like a physical ache in my chest most days. An hour passed before I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting on cold ground. I put the key in my pocket and touched Mom's name carved in the stone before walking back to my car. The next morning, I texted Mila and asked if she could come with me to the storage unit. She showed up 20 minutes later with coffee and didn't ask questions when I told her where we were going. The facility was on Maple Street, like Lindsay said, one of those places with rows of orange metal doors and concrete everywhere. I found Unit 47B at the end of the second row and stood there staring at the lock for a full minute before using the key. The door rolled up with a metallic screech and I hit the light switch inside. The unit was maybe 10 by 10 feet, packed floor to ceiling with labeled boxes and plastic storage containers. Everything was organized by category with labels in Lindsay's neat handwriting. I saw boxes marked recipes, books, photos, kitchen items, bedroom decorations. Mom's recipe box sat on top of one stack in a clear protective sleeve. I picked it up and opened it, seeing Mom's handwriting on the index cards inside. My throat got tight and I had to set it down for a second. Mila squeezed my shoulder and started looking through the photo albums while I went through the other boxes. I found the one labeled Hannah's room pushed against the back wall. Inside were all the framed photos Lindsay had made Dad take down from my walls, wrapped individually in bubble wrap. There were pictures of me and Mom at the beach, at my 8th grade graduation, making cookies in our old kitchen. Underneath the photos was a note from Lindsay on plain white paper. She wrote that she couldn't look at the photos every day without having panic attacks about losing people she loved. She said she knew it hurt me, but she was trying to survive the only way she knew how. She said she never threw anything away because these were my memories, and she had no right to destroy them even if seeing them broke her. I read the note 3 times and felt something shift in my chest. She was protecting herself even if it meant hurting me, and maybe that was messed up, but I understood it better now. Mila helped me carry boxes to my car, loading the recipes and photo albums first. We made 3 trips back and forth, her not saying much but staying close. When we had everything I wanted in the car, she told me about her grandmother dying 2 years ago, and how her mom had cleaned out the house within a week. She said her mom couldn't handle being surrounded by reminders, and it caused a huge fight in their family. She said sometimes people deal with grief in really screwed up ways, and it doesn't mean they're bad people, just broken ones. I told her I felt crazy for being mad at Lindsay and sympathetic to her at the same time. She said that made perfect sense and I wasn't crazy at all. We locked up the unit and I kept the key, thinking I'd come back for more stuff later. When I got home, Dad was in the kitchen attempting to make something for dinner. Pots were everywhere and smoke was coming from the oven and he looked completely lost. I set the recipe box on the counter and suggested we make Mom's lasagna together. His eyes got wet immediately and he nodded, pulling out the burnt whatever from the oven. I found the lasagna recipe card and we started gathering ingredients, working side by side without talking much. He chopped onions and started crying harder, and I knew the onions were only part of it. We layered noodles and sauce and cheese in Mom's old glass pan, the one with the chipped corner she refused to replace. The kitchen smelled like garlic and tomatoes and something close to normal. We slid the pan into the oven and set the timer, then cleaned up the mess Dad had made earlier. It felt like the beginning of something. Maybe not forgiveness, but at least understanding. Over dinner, Dad told me the whole story of how he met Lindsay. He was at the cancer center visiting Mom one afternoon, and Lindsay was sitting alone in the waiting area looking exhausted. Mom invited her to sit with them, and they started talking about treatment side effects and clinical trials. Lindsay's family lived in another state and couldn't visit often, so Mom sort of adopted her as a chemo buddy. They'd text each other before appointments and sit together during infusions. Dad said Mom really cared about Lindsay and wanted her in our lives if something happened. He said Mom told him once that Lindsay understood loss in a way most people didn't, and that made her someone he could lean on. I asked him if he loved Lindsay, or if he just needed someone to fill the empty space Mom left. He was quiet for a long time before answering. He admitted it wasn't about moving on, but about not being able to stand the silent house. He said every room reminded him of Mom dying, and he felt like he was suffocating. Lindsay was drowning too, and they grabbed onto each other like desperate people do. He said marrying her a year later was probably too fast, but they were both so broken they couldn't think straight. He said it didn't excuse how they handled things with me or how they let me think Lindsay was the enemy. He said he should have been honest from the start instead of taking the coward's way out. I told him that didn't make it okay, but at least I understood it better now. We finished eating in silence, and I helped him load the dishwasher before going to my room. The next day, I went back to the hospital with some of Mom's photo albums. Lindsay was sitting up in bed looking less pale than before, and she smiled when she saw what I was carrying. We spread the albums across her lap and started going through them page by page. She told me stories I'd never heard before about Mom during chemo. Apparently, Mom had this dark sense of humor about dying, and used to joke about haunting people who didn't follow her wishes. Lindsay said Mom once told the nurses she was going to come back as a really annoying ghost if they didn't let her have chocolate pudding. She said Mom made everyone laugh even when things were terrible, and that's what got Lindsay through her own treatment. I could hear Mom's voice in the stories, and it made me miss her, and feel closer to her at the same time. Lindsay pulled out her old phone from the drawer beside her bed, and showed me text messages she'd saved from Mom. There were dozens of them from the last few months of Mom's life. Mom really did encourage Lindsay to look after us, writing things about Dad needing someone to organize his life, and me needing someone stubborn enough to push me toward my future. There was one message where Mom joked about Dad's sock drawer being a disaster, and Lindsay needing to fix it when she was gone. I laughed reading it because Mom was always complaining about Dad's socks. Lindsay scrolled through more messages, and I saw Mom's personality in every word, her humor and her practicality and her love for us. It hurt to read them, but it also felt like a gift. I asked Lindsay about her first husband, and her whole face changed. She told me about watching him die over 2 years, how the cancer ate away at him piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. She said when she met Mom at the cancer center and realized another person was going through the same nightmare, it triggered everything she'd buried. She started having panic attacks in the middle of the night, and nightmares about losing people. She said that's why she pushed so hard to remove reminders of illness and death from our house after she moved in. She thought if she could erase the visible signs of loss, then maybe she could function without falling apart. She said she knows now that was wrong, and it just made everything worse for everyone. She said she's been running from death for so long she forgot how to actually live with grief instead of against it. I stayed quiet while she talked about running from death, and finally understood why she'd acted the way she did. Lindsay pulled out her phone again and showed me more texts from her therapist, appointments she'd kept for almost 2 years after marrying Dad. The messages talked about processing trauma and survivor's guilt, and learning to live with loss instead of trying to erase it. She scrolled to the last appointment date from 6 months ago and admitted she'd stopped going because she thought she'd fixed herself. She said that was stupid because trauma doesn't just disappear, it waits for you to let your guard down. She asked if I would consider doing family therapy with her and Dad, maybe with someone who specialized in blended families and grief. I told her I'd think about it because I wasn't ready to commit to anything yet, but I also wasn't ready to say no. She nodded and said that was fair, that she'd earned my hesitation through every bad choice she'd made since moving into our house. Dr. Owens came back into the room carrying a tablet and pulled up a chair next to Lindsay's bed. He explained the treatment options in detail, talking about aggressive chemotherapy that might slow the cancer's spread, but would make her incredibly sick. He showed us scans on the tablet where bright spots marked tumors in her liver and lungs, pointing out which ones were growing fastest. Lindsay stared at the images like she was memorizing them, her jaw tight. He said without treatment she had maybe 6 months, with treatment possibly a year or more, but no guarantees. The chemo would mean losing her hair again, constant nausea, exhaustion so deep she'd barely be able to get out of bed some days. Dad reached for her hand, but she pulled away, still looking at those glowing spots on the screen. Then she turned to look at me and Dad, really looked at us and said she wanted to try the aggressive treatment because she wasn't ready to give up yet. I squeezed her hand hard and told her we'd be there for whatever she needed, every appointment and every bad day. Dad finally spoke up and promised the same thing, his voice cracking. And Dr. Owens scheduled her first treatment for the following week and left us with a stack of information about side effects and support resources. I drove home alone that evening because Dad stayed at the hospital with Lindsay for more tests. The house felt different when I walked in. Like all the anger I'd carried around for a year had left gaps in the walls. I made myself a sandwich and sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing until someone knocked on the door. Austin stood on the porch holding a grocery bag. Mila's older brother, who I'd only talked to a few times at family dinners. He said Mila told him what was happening and he wanted to check on me. I let him in and we sat in the living room while he unpacked the bag, pulling out tea and crackers and ginger ale. He told me his dad died of cancer 3 years ago, and he remembered what it was like being the support person for someone going through treatment. He said the hardest part was feeling angry and scared and confused all at the same time, wanting to be strong but also wanting to scream at the unfairness of it all. He explained that I didn't have to forgive everything right away, that supporting Lindsay through cancer didn't mean pretending the past year didn't hurt. He stayed for an hour telling me practical things like keeping snacks in my car for hospital visits and learning which smells would make Lindsay sick. When he left, he gave me his number and said to call anytime, even at 3 in the morning when the fear got too big to handle alone. I couldn't sleep that night, so I drove to the storage unit with the key Lindsay had mentioned. Unit 47B was packed floor to ceiling with boxes, all labeled in Lindsay's neat handwriting. I found the ones marked with Mom's name and started opening them in the dim light from my phone. Mom's journal was in a box labeled Sarah's personal items, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious. I sat on the concrete floor and opened it, my hands shaking. The first few entries were from 2 years before she died, talking about garden plans and my upcoming birthday. I flipped forward to the last months and found pages filled with her fears about leaving me and Dad alone. She wrote about meeting Lindsay at the cancer center and feeling grateful someone understood what she was going through. One entry described watching Lindsay break down in the bathroom after learning her cancer was in remission, how Lindsay felt guilty for surviving when so many others didn't. Mom wrote that she wished she could help Lindsay see remission as a gift instead of a burden. I kept reading through tears that made the words blur. Mom wrote about her body failing and her terror that Dad wouldn't be able to handle single parenting. She wrote about me starting to pull away as her illness got worse, and how much that hurt, even though she understood why. The entries talked about Lindsay's strength and stubbornness, how Lindsay kept showing up to support group even after her own treatment ended, because she couldn't abandon the people still fighting. Mom wrote that if she had to pick someone to help Dad and me survive her death, it would be Lindsay, because Lindsay had already survived the unsurvivable. The entry from 2 weeks before Mom died made me stop breathing. She wrote that Lindsay was strong enough to handle Dad's emotional unavailability, the way he shut down instead of processing feelings. She said Lindsay was stubborn enough to push me when I needed it, to not let me hide in my grief forever. Mom wrote that Lindsay had been through hell with her first husband's death and her own cancer, and that surviving all that made her exactly the right person to help us survive too. She wrote that she'd asked Lindsay to promise to look after us, knowing it wouldn't be easy but trusting Lindsay would try. Reading Mom's actual words about Lindsay in her own handwriting changed something inside me, shifted the anger into something more complicated I didn't have a name for yet. I brought the journal to the hospital the next morning and found Lindsay awake and looking slightly better. Dad had gone home to shower, so it was just us. I sat in the chair next to her bed and opened the journal to that entry from 2 weeks before Mom died. My voice shook as I read Mom's words out loud, about Lindsay being strong and stubborn and the right person to help us survive. Lindsay's face crumpled and she started crying harder than I'd ever seen anyone cry. These deep sobs that shook her whole body. She said she'd felt like she failed Mom every single day since the wedding, that she'd made everything worse instead of better. She said she thought being tough and removing reminders of Mom would help us heal faster, like ripping off a bandage. She said she realized now that grief doesn't work that way, that she'd just made us all more miserable by trying to erase someone we loved. I told Lindsay I understood why she did what she did, even though it hurt me deeply. I explained that erasing Mom from the house made me feel like Mom never mattered, like Lindsay was trying to replace her instead of honor her memory. I said I needed her to understand that keeping Mom's photos up didn't mean we couldn't move forward. It meant we were taking Mom with us into whatever came next. Lindsay grabbed my hand and promised that if she got through this treatment, things would be different. She said she'd put Mom's photos back up herself, and we'd cook Mom's recipes together, and she'd never ask me to forget the person who gave me life. Lindsay started her first round of chemotherapy the following week, and it destroyed her. Dad brought her home after the treatment, and she could barely walk from the car to the house. I'd prepared the guest room downstairs so she wouldn't have to climb stairs, filling it with extra pillows and buckets and towels. Within hours, she was throwing up everything in her stomach, and then dry heaving when nothing was left. I brought her ginger tea and sat with her while she was sick, holding her hair back when she leaned over the bucket. Dad tried to help, but he got overwhelmed too easily, his face going pale when Lindsay retched. I ended up being the one who stayed with her through the worst parts, wiping her face with cool washcloths and helping her sip water. She apologized constantly between bouts of nausea, and I kept telling her to stop apologizing, that this was what family did. Mila came over one afternoon a few weeks into Lindsay's treatment and found me staring at the blank hallway wall where Mom's height measurements used to be. She asked what I was thinking about, and I told her I wanted to put Mom's photos back up, but didn't know if Lindsay would be okay with it yet. Mila said there was only one way to find out, and pulled out her phone to look at the photos I'd taken of Mom's pictures in storage. We spent the next 2 hours creating a gallery wall in the hallway, arranging frames in different sizes and patterns. I included photos of Mom at different ages, Mom and Dad on their wedding day, Mom holding me as a baby. Right in the center, I hung the photo I'd found of Mom and Lindsay together at the cancer center, both of them wearing headscarves and smiling despite everything. Lindsay came out of the guest room slowly, holding onto the wall for support, and saw what we'd done. She stood there crying and said it was perfect, exactly what Mom would have wanted. I started attending the grief support group at the cancer center that Tabitha Meyer ran every Thursday evening. The room was full of people my age who'd lost parents or siblings, all of us trying to figure out how to keep living when someone we loved was gone. Tabitha encouraged us to be honest about our feelings, even the ugly ones like anger and resentment. I talked about my complicated feelings toward Lindsay, how I was caring for her while still processing the hurt from the past year. Other people shared similar stories about family members who'd disappointed them, but who they couldn't abandon. Tabitha said grief and anger could exist together, that forgiveness was a process, not a destination. She said supporting Lindsay didn't erase what Lindsay had done wrong. It just meant I was choosing compassion over continued punishment. The group helped me understand I wasn't alone in feeling torn between multiple emotions at once. 3 weeks passed with Lindsay getting sicker after each treatment. I watched her lose more weight and more hair until she looked nothing like the woman who'd married my dad. One afternoon, I found her in the guest room staring at the ceiling with tears running down into her ears. She didn't move when I came in. I sat on the edge of her bed and waited. She turned her head slowly and looked at me with eyes that seemed too big for her face. She told me she didn't think she could keep doing this, that maybe it would be better to just stop fighting. I felt my chest get tight because I'd been preparing myself for her to die, not for her to give up. I started talking without planning what to say. I told her about finding the college fund and how furious I'd been when I first saw it. I explained that I'd wanted to hate her for selling the watch, but the money sitting there in my name made everything complicated. I said I realized she actually cared about my future, even when I thought she was just trying to erase Mom. Lindsay grabbed my hand and squeezed it hard enough to hurt. She said watching me go to college would be worth every second of this suffering if she could make it that long. She said Mom had talked constantly about wanting me to get a good education, and she couldn't let Mom down. I stayed with her until she fell asleep, and then I went to my room and cried for an hour. Dad came home from work late that night, and I heard him drop his keys twice trying to unlock the door. I found him in the kitchen standing in front of the open refrigerator like he'd forgotten what he was looking for. He looked at me, and his face just crumpled. He sat down at the table and put his head in his hands. I'd never seen him cry before, not even at Mom's funeral. He kept saying he was sorry over and over. I sat down across from him and waited for him to get control of himself. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red and swollen. He told me he was scared of losing another wife and he didn't know how to handle it. He admitted he'd let Lindsay be the bad guy for everything, because he couldn't face having hard conversations with me. He said he'd been paralyzed by fear for over a year, and he knew it was wrong. I felt anger rising up in my throat. I told him I couldn't be his emotional support while also dealing with my own grief about Mom and now Lindsay. I said he needed to see a therapist because I was drowning trying to take care of everyone. He nodded and said he would. I didn't believe him. The next morning, I brought it up again over breakfast. Dad tried to change the subject, but I wouldn't let him. I pulled up Kayla's contact information on my phone and put it in front of him. I told him Lindsay had mentioned her as a good family therapist, and he needed to call today. He pushed the phone back toward me and said he didn't need therapy. He just needed to be stronger. I stood up and told him I was serious about moving out if he didn't get help. I said I couldn't watch him fall apart while pretending everything was fine. He stared at me for a long time. Then he picked up my phone and made the appointment. His first session was 2 days later. He came home looking exhausted and went straight to his room. I knocked on his door after an hour. He was sitting on his bed holding a photo of Mom. He started talking without me asking. He told me Kayla had made him realize he'd never actually grieved Mom because he'd jumped straight into taking care of me and then into a new relationship with Lindsay. He said he'd been running from his feelings for so long he didn't know how to stop. I sat next to him and we looked at the photo together. It was from their honeymoon, both of them smiling on a beach somewhere. He told me he still loved Mom and always would, but he also loved Lindsay and felt guilty about it. I said loving Lindsay didn't erase Mom, and Mom would want him to be happy. He hugged me and thanked me for forcing him to go to therapy. Lindsay had a good week where the nausea wasn't as bad and she could actually eat solid food. She asked if we could go through more of Mom's boxes together. We spread everything out in the living room and she helped me sort through items I didn't understand. She picked up a weird ceramic owl and laughed. She told me Mom had bought it at a yard sale because she thought it was so ugly it was funny. She said Mom used to move it around the house to surprise Dad and make him laugh. I'd seen that owl my whole life and never knew the story. Lindsay found Mom's old recipe cards and we looked through them together. She pointed out notes Mom had written in the margins about Dad's preferences. She showed me where Mom had written, "Paul hates onions," and "extra garlic for my guy" on different recipes. We spent hours going through everything. Lindsay told me about Mom's terrible singing voice and how she'd belt out songs in the car without caring who heard. She said Mom had this thing about organizing everything by color, even her spice rack. I remembered the spice rack and how confused I'd been when Lindsay had reorganized it by alphabetical order. Lindsay saw my face change and apologized for changing things without understanding why they mattered. I asked Lindsay about the BMW while we were putting boxes away. I said I'd been wondering if she really needed a new car or if there was another reason she bought it. She stopped moving and looked at me. She admitted she'd been planning to give me her old car when I graduated high school. She said she wanted something reliable for herself so I could have a car for college. She explained that she should have just told me that instead of letting me think she was being selfish with the watch money. I felt stupid for not considering there might be a reasonable explanation. She said she'd made a lot of mistakes by trying to protect me from hard truths instead of just being honest. I told her we were both learning how to be a family, and it was okay to mess up sometimes. Our first family therapy session with Kayla happened the following week. We sat in her office in a triangle formation with tissues on every surface. Kayla asked me to talk about how the past year had affected me. I looked at Dad and Lindsay and decided to just say everything. I told them that every time Lindsay removed something of Mom's, I felt like I was losing Mom all over again. I explained that watching our house get emptied of Mom's presents had made me feel like she'd never existed. I said Dad's silence during all of it had felt like betrayal, like he was choosing Lindsay over Mom's memory. Lindsay started crying immediately. Dad looked at the floor. Kayla let the silence sit for a minute. Then she asked Dad and Lindsay to respond. Dad apologized for being emotionally absent and said he understood now how much damage his silence had caused. Lindsay apologized for not considering how her actions would affect me and said she'd been so focused on her own trauma that she couldn't see mine. Kayla helped us create a plan for better communication. We agreed to have weekly family meetings where we could talk about difficult things before they became huge problems. We promised to be honest about our feelings even when it was uncomfortable. It felt like the first real conversation we'd had as a family. Lindsay's next appointment with Dr. Owens brought surprisingly good news. The scans showed her tumors were shrinking slightly. Dr. Owens was careful to say that stage 4 cancer was still very serious, and we shouldn't get too hopeful. But the treatment was working better than expected. Lindsay cried with relief. Dad hugged her so tight I thought he might hurt her. Dr. Owens explained that she'd need to continue treatment for the foreseeable future, and the cancer could still progress. But for now, things were moving in the right direction. Lindsay decided she wanted to make the most of whatever time she had, whether it was months or years. She said she was done just surviving and wanted to actually live. She asked Dad and me what we wanted to do as a family. I suggested we start doing things Mom had loved, like cooking her recipes and having people over. Lindsay's face lit up. I brought up the idea of having a memorial dinner for Mom during our next family meeting. I explained that I wanted to cook Mom's recipes and invite people who knew her to share memories. Lindsay loved the idea immediately. She suggested inviting some of Mom's friends from the Cancer Center support group. Dad looked nervous but agreed it was a good idea. We picked a date 2 weeks out to give us time to prepare. Lindsay and I started going through Mom's recipe box to choose dishes. We picked Mom's famous lasagna, her garlic bread that Dad loved, and her chocolate cake that was always too rich but nobody cared. Dad offered to help with the shopping. It felt good to be planning something together instead of just dealing with medical appointments and treatments. Mila came over to help me test out Mom's recipes before the actual dinner. We started with the lasagna and immediately ran into problems. Mom's handwriting was awful, and we couldn't tell if she'd written 2 tablespoons or 2 teaspoons of oregano. We guessed wrong and ended up with something that tasted like an Italian restaurant exploded. Mila laughed so hard she couldn't breathe. We tried again with less oregano and it turned out better. The chocolate cake was another disaster because we couldn't read whether it needed 1 cup or 1.5 cups of sugar. The first attempt was so sweet it hurt our teeth. The second one was perfect. We spent the whole afternoon cooking and laughing and making a huge mess in the kitchen. It felt good to remember Mom with joy instead of just sadness. Mila said Mom would have loved watching us struggle with her terrible handwriting. She was probably right. The memorial dinner happened on a Saturday evening. We'd invited 8 of Mom's Cancer Center friends plus Mila and her family. I spent the morning cooking with Lindsay while Dad cleaned the house. Lindsay was tired but insisted on helping. We made all of Mom's recipes and set up a photo display in the dining room. People started arriving around 6. I recognized some of them from Mom's funeral, but others I'd never met. Everyone brought stories about Mom. One woman told me Mom had made her laugh during her worst chemo session by doing impressions of the nurses. Another man said Mom had convinced him to keep fighting when he wanted to give up. Lindsay stood up and shared her own story about meeting Mom and how Mom's strength had inspired her to try the experimental treatment that saved her life. She talked about Mom's kindness and humor even when she was dying. Several people were crying. Dad gave a speech about how Mom would want us to live fully and love openly instead of staying stuck in grief. He looked at Lindsay when he said it, and I saw real love in his eyes. The evening was both beautiful and sad. After everyone left, the 3 of us sat surrounded by photos of Mom and talked for hours. It felt like we'd finally found a way to honor Mom while also moving forward as a family. Lindsay wanted to keep talking, but her eyes kept closing. Dad suggested we all get some rest and pick up the conversation tomorrow. I helped Lindsay to her bedroom while Dad cleaned up the living room. She squeezed my hand before I left and whispered thank you. I went to my room and stared at the ceiling for hours, thinking about everything we'd said. The house felt different now, like something heavy had lifted, even though we still had so much to figure out. The next morning, I found Dad making coffee in the kitchen. He looked tired but less tense than usual. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him at the table. We sat in silence for a few minutes before I told him I'd been thinking about college. He looked up quickly and I could see worry in his eyes. I explained that I wanted to defer for a semester, so I could be home during Lindsay's treatment. He started to protest, but I cut him off. This wasn't about putting my life on hold. It was about choosing where I wanted to be right now. Lindsay's treatment was going to be rough, and I didn't want to be hours away dealing with homework while she was sick. Dad argued that Mom would want me to go to the school, but I reminded him that Mom also wanted us to take care of each other. We went back and forth for 20 minutes before Lindsay came downstairs in her robe. She'd heard us talking and immediately said no. She wasn't going to let me defer college because of her. I stayed calm and explained that this was my decision, not hers. I'd already looked into online classes I could take to stay on track. We could compromise where I took a reduced course load from home instead of going away completely. Lindsay's eyes filled with tears and she tried to argue, but her voice broke. Dad looked between us and finally said that if this was what I really wanted, he wouldn't stop me. Lindsay protested again, but I could see she was relieved. We agreed I'd take 2 online classes in the fall and apply for spring admission if things were stable. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. 3 weeks later, Lindsay woke up in the middle of the night, throwing up so violently that Dad called an ambulance. I rode with her to the hospital while Dad followed in his car. The EMTs kept asking her questions, but she could barely answer between waves of nausea. At the emergency room, they got her on IV fluids right away. The doctor said she was severely dehydrated from the chemo and needed to stay overnight for monitoring. Dad went home around 3 in the morning to get some sleep, but I stayed in the chair next to her bed. Lindsay drifted in and out of sleep while the IV dripped steadily. Around dawn, she woke up more alert and found me still sitting there. She asked why I hadn't gone home, and I told her I promised I'd be here. She was quiet for a minute, then started talking about her first husband. His name was Michael, and he'd been a teacher. The cancer took him slowly over 2 years, and she'd watched him fade away piece by piece. When he died, she felt guilty for being relieved it was over. Then her own cancer diagnosis came, and she felt like punishment for that relief. Meeting Mom at the cancer center changed everything because Mom refused to let her wallow in guilt. Mom told her that survivor's guilt doesn't honor the dead. Living well does. Lindsay said she forgot that lesson after Mom died and got caught up in trying to fulfill her promise instead of actually living. She looked at me with tears running down her face and apologized for losing sight of what Mom really wanted. I held her hand and told her we were all learning how to do this better. After Lindsay came home from the hospital, I started wearing the replica watch every day. At first, nobody noticed, but then people started asking about it. The cashier at the grocery store commented on how beautiful it was. Mila asked if it was new. Each time someone asked, I explained it was a family heirloom with a complicated history. I told them it represented both my mom and my stepmom now, 2 women who understood loss and tried to take care of the people they loved. Lindsay noticed me wearing it about a week later when I was making dinner. She stared at my wrist for a long moment, then her eyes got wet. She told me that was the most meaningful thing anyone had ever done for her. I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged her while she cried into my shoulder. Dad walked in and saw us and smiled for the first time in weeks. A month later, Dad and Lindsay decided they wanted to renew their commitment to each other. Not a big wedding, just a small ceremony at our house with me, Mila, and Austin present. Lindsay said she wanted to recommit to being honest and supporting each other through hard times instead of hiding behind walls. They wrote their own promises to each other and asked me to read something from Mom's journal. I picked a passage about love persisting through loss, and how the people we love never really leave us. Dad's voice shook when he promised to stop hiding from difficult emotions and be present for both of us. Lindsay promised to let us grieve naturally instead of trying to control everything. When I finished reading Mom's words, everyone was crying, including Austin, who barely even knew us. Mila squeezed my hand and whispered that Mom would be proud. After the ceremony, we ate cake in the kitchen and looked through old photos together. It felt like a new beginning without erasing what came before. Lindsay's next scan results came back mixed. Some tumors were stable, but others were growing. I sat with her and Dad in the oncology office while the doctor explained the options. He recommended switching to a more aggressive treatment that would make her sicker, but might slow the cancer's progression. Lindsay looked exhausted just thinking about it. She asked how much time the new treatment might buy her, and the doctor said maybe 6 months to a year if it worked. Dad reached for her hand and she gripped it tight. I told her whatever she decided, I'd be there for every appointment and treatment. She nodded slowly and agreed to try the new protocol. The doctor scheduled her first session for the following week and gave us information about managing the side effects. Walking out of the cancer center, Lindsay leaned heavily on Dad's arm. I followed behind them, carrying the folders of paperwork and wondering how much more her body could take. I started going to Mom's grave more often after that appointment. I'd sit on the grass next to her headstone and tell her everything that was happening. I told her about Lindsay's treatment and how our family was slowly healing. I told her about the conversations we were finally having and the photos we'd put back up around the house. Sometimes I cried, and sometimes I just sat in silence. One afternoon, I told her I thought she'd be proud of us for being honest with each other, even though it took almost losing Lindsay to get there. The words felt true as I said them. These visits helped me feel connected to Mom while also moving forward with Lindsay and Dad. I wasn't choosing between them anymore. I was finding a way to love them both. Austin started coming by the house regularly to help with practical things. He'd show up on Saturday mornings to mow the lawn or take out the recycling without being asked. When Dad and I were overwhelmed with Lindsay's care, he'd do the grocery shopping or pick up prescriptions. We developed an easy friendship based on understanding loss without having to explain it. He'd lost his dad 3 years ago and knew what it felt like to watch someone you love get sick. One evening, we sat on the back porch while Lindsay rested inside, and he told me it was okay to be angry and sad and scared all at once. He said grief wasn't linear and some days would be harder than others. His honesty helped me process my own complicated feelings without judgment. I was grateful to have someone who got it without me having to pretend everything was fine. Lindsay had a good day about 6 weeks into the new treatment and insisted we go to the storage unit together. She wanted to decide what to keep at the house and what to leave in storage. Dad offered to come, but Lindsay said this was something she and I needed to do alone. We drove to the facility, and I unlocked Unit 47B. Inside were all of Mom's belongings carefully packed and labeled, just like I remembered. Lindsay moved slowly through the boxes, pointing out items and sharing memories. She helped me understand that keeping everything wasn't the same as honoring Mom's memory. We could select meaningful items to display and carefully repack the rest for when I had my own place someday. We chose Mom's favorite cookbook, a quilt she'd made, and some of her jewelry. Lindsay suggested we bring home the photo albums so we could look through them together as a family. By the time we finished, the sun was setting and we were both exhausted. Loading the selected boxes into the car felt like carrying pieces of Mom back where they belonged. Late that night, Lindsay couldn't sleep because of nausea from her treatment. I heard her moving around downstairs and found her on the couch wrapped in blankets. I made her ginger tea and sat with her while she sipped it slowly. She started talking about the day Mom died and how she'd promised at the funeral to take care of us. She said she'd been so focused on that promise that she forgot to actually live and let us grieve naturally. She asked for my forgiveness not for her intentions, but for how she'd executed everything. I looked at her tired face and the way her hands shook holding the mug, and I told her honestly that I forgave her. We'd all made mistakes trying to deal with impossible grief. What mattered now was that we were finally being real with each other. She cried quietly, and I stayed with her until she fell asleep on the couch. I spent the next week in the Cancer Center library reading everything I could find about terminal illness support systems. The librarian brought me stacks of books about grief counseling and family advocacy programs. I took notes on my laptop about different organizations that helped families navigate end-of-life care. Some of the stories made me cry, but they also made me understand that what we were going through wasn't unique. Thousands of families dealt with this every year, and many of them felt just as lost as I did. I printed out information about support groups and training programs for people who wanted to work in cancer advocacy. The more I read, the more I realized this was something I could actually do with my life. Tabitha found me there on Thursday afternoon surrounded by papers and books. She sat down across from me and asked what I was researching. I explained that I wanted to help other people going through what our family was experiencing. She smiled and told me that social work or counseling might be perfect career paths for someone with my perspective. She said living through trauma didn't make someone broken, but it could make them uniquely qualified to help others. We talked for over an hour about different programs and what kind of education I would need. She gave me contact information for several people she knew in the field and told me to reach out when I was ready. Walking to my car that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Purpose, direction, a reason to think about the future instead of just surviving the present. Dad was in the kitchen when I got home that evening, and the smell hit me before I even opened the door. Pot roast. Mom's pot roast, specifically with the way the herbs and garlic mixed together in a smell that meant Sunday dinner. I walked in and found him at the stove checking the meat thermometer with an intensity I'd never seen him bring to cooking before. Lindsay was sitting at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket, looking tired but amused. Dad looked up when he heard me, and his face was nervous like he was waiting for judgment. I asked him what was going on, and he admitted he'd been practicing Mom's pot roast recipe for weeks. He said he'd ruined 4 roasts learning the timing and nearly set the kitchen on fire twice. But he finally got it right. Lindsay added that she'd been his very patient taste tester through all the failures. We set the table together, and Dad carved the roast with shaking hands. The first bite transported me back to Sunday dinners when Mom was alive and everything felt safe. It tasted exactly like I remembered. Lindsay started telling a story about the time Mom tried to teach her to make pot roast at the Cancer Center using the microwave in the break room. Apparently, they'd created something that looked like leather and smelled worse. Dad shared a memory about the first time Mom made pot roast for him, and how he'd pretended to love it even though she'd forgotten to add salt. I talked about Sunday dinners when I was little and how Mom would let me help with the vegetables even though I was terrible at peeling carrots. We laughed and cried and passed the serving dishes around the table. The food was perfect, but it was more than that. Sitting there together sharing memories of Mom without pain or guilt felt like she was there with us somehow. Like she'd brought us together across time and death to remind us that family was about more than blood or loss. It was about showing up and trying and loving each other through the hard parts. 2 weeks later, Lindsay had another appointment with Dr. Owens, and this time the news wasn't good. Her body wasn't handling the aggressive chemotherapy well anymore. She'd lost 15 pounds and could barely keep food down. Her blood counts were dangerously low and she'd developed an infection that required antibiotics. Dr. Owens sat us down in his office and explained that continuing this treatment protocol might do more harm than good at this point. He presented the option of switching to palliative care, which would focus on keeping Lindsay comfortable instead of trying to fight the cancer aggressively. He said palliative care didn't mean giving up, but rather choosing quality of life over quantity. Lindsay listened quietly while he explained the options and then asked for time to think about it. We drove home in silence and Lindsay went straight to bed. Dad and I sat in the living room not knowing what to say or do. Finally, I suggested we have a family meeting to talk about what Lindsay wanted. Dad agreed, and we waited until Lindsay woke up from her nap before gathering in the living room. Lindsay looked small sitting on the couch with her legs tucked under her. She said she needed to hear what we thought before making a decision. Dad told her he wanted whatever would keep her with us longest, but he couldn't stand watching her suffer like this. I said I wanted her to be comfortable and present more than I wanted her to be sick and miserable for a few extra months. Lindsay nodded and wiped her eyes. We talked for 3 hours that night about death and hope, and what it meant to fight versus what it meant to let go. Lindsay said she wasn't ready to stop treatment entirely, but she also wasn't willing to spend whatever time she had left being so sick she couldn't function. She wanted to try one more round of the aggressive treatment, and if it didn't show real improvement, she would switch to palliative care. She said she wasn't giving up, but she was also being realistic about what her body could handle. I told her I supported whatever decision she made, and that we would make sure she was comfortable and surrounded by love no matter what. Dad promised the same thing and added that he was proud of her for being honest about her limits. Lindsay cried and said she was scared of dying, but she was more scared of wasting whatever time she had left being too sick to appreciate it. We sat together on the couch until late into the night just being present with each other. No phones or television or distractions. Just 3 people who'd been through hell together trying to figure out how to face what came next. When Lindsay finally went to bed, Dad and I stayed up talking about practical things like advanced directives and hospice care. It was hard but necessary, and I was grateful we could finally have these conversations without pretending everything would be fine. Lindsay started her final aggressive treatment round the following Monday. Dr. Owens warned us it would be rough, but Lindsay was determined to give it one more try. The first few days were brutal. She couldn't keep anything down and spent most of her time sleeping or in the bathroom. I took time off from my volunteer work at the cancer center to be home with her. Dad arranged to work from home so we could trade off sitting with her. Austin stopped by most days to help with things around the house that we didn't have energy for. By the end of the first week, Lindsay looked like a ghost of herself. But then something shifted. Her appetite came back slightly and she could sit up without feeling dizzy. The nausea decreased enough that she could drink ginger tea and eat crackers. By week 2, she was walking around the house without needing to rest every few minutes. When we went back for her follow-up scan 3 weeks later, I was terrified of what Dr. Owens would say. But his face when he came into the exam room was cautiously optimistic. The scans showed improvement. Not remission, but the tumors had shrunk and some of the smaller ones were barely visible. He said continuing with a modified, less intense treatment protocol might be worthwhile. Lindsay asked what modified meant, and he explained they could reduce the dosage and frequency to something her body could tolerate better while still fighting the cancer. Lindsay looked at me and Dad, and then back at Dr. Owens. She said yes. She wanted to continue with the understanding that she could stop whenever she wanted if it became too much. Dr. Owens agreed and scheduled her next treatment. We celebrated that night with ice cream sundaes in Lindsay's hospital room. The nurse brought us extra toppings and didn't say anything about the visiting hours being over. We ate ice cream and talked about small victories and taking things one day at a time. Lindsay said she felt like she'd been given a gift of more time and she wasn't going to waste it. I spent the next week working on college applications. I decided to apply again for the spring semester, but this time with a focus on psychology and social work programs. Lindsay helped me with my application essays, even though she was still recovering from treatment. We sat at the kitchen table with my laptop between us, and she asked me questions about why I wanted to study social work. I told her about the families I'd met at the cancer center and how much I wanted to help people navigate the impossible emotions that came with terminal illness. I wrote about learning that family wasn't just blood, but the people who showed up when life got hard. I wrote about forgiveness and second chances, and how sometimes the people who hurt us are also the ones who save us. Lindsay read my essay and started crying. She said it was beautiful and honest and that she was honored to be part of my story now. I told her she wasn't just part of my story but a main character in it. She helped me refine the essay and apply to 6 different schools. We researched programs together and made lists of pros and cons for each one. It felt good to think about the future again, to plan for something beyond the next doctor's appointment or treatment round. Dad suggested we start some new family traditions that honored both Mom's memory and our current reality. Sunday dinners became a mix of Mom's recipes and new dishes Lindsay taught me how to make. We kept all of Mom's photos up in the house but added new pictures of the 3 of us together. The gallery wall in the hallway grew to include both past and present. Lindsay framed some of the photos from Mom's albums and hung them in the living room. We put Mom's recipe box on the kitchen counter where we could see it every day. The house started feeling less like a museum to the past, and more like a home that acknowledged where we'd been while embracing where we were going. Lindsay planted flowers in the garden that Mom had started years ago. She said she wanted to tend something Mom had loved, We spent a Saturday afternoon working in the dirt together, pulling weeds and adding new plants. Lindsay told me stories about her own mother who had died when she was young. She said losing her mom had made her understand how important it was to honor the people we'd lost while still living our own lives. I asked her if she thought mom would be okay with how things had turned out, and she said she thought mom would be proud of all of us for finally being honest with each other. Lindsay's father visited on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I hadn't seen him since before everything happened, and I was nervous about the meeting. He arrived with flowers for Lindsay and an envelope for me. We sat in the living room and he apologized directly for his role in the watch situation. He said he hadn't known the full story when he bought it, and if he had, he would have handled things differently. He offered to sell the watch back to us at the original price. I looked at the envelope he'd given me, which I assumed contained a check or legal documents. But I told him to keep the watch. I explained that the college fund mattered more than the physical object, and that mom would have wanted it that way. He looked surprised, and then touched. He told Lindsay she'd raised me well. Lindsay corrected him gently. She said my mom raised me, but she was grateful to be part of my life now. Her father nodded and said he could see mom's influence in the person I'd become. We had coffee together and talked about less heavy things. He told stories about Lindsay as a child and showed me pictures on his phone. Lindsay rolled her eyes but smiled. When he left, he hugged all three of us and told us he was proud of how we'd worked through everything. After he drove away, Lindsay said that was the first time her father had told her he was proud of her in years. My next therapy session with Tabitha was different from the others. I'd been seeing her weekly since Lindsay's cancer came back and we'd covered a lot of ground. But this session, something clicked into place that hadn't before. I was talking about my anger toward Lindsay and how it still flared up sometimes even though I'd forgiven her. Tabitha asked me what I thought the anger was really about. I started to give my usual answer about Lindsay erasing mom, but then I stopped. The truth that I'd been avoiding hit me hard. I'd been holding on to anger at Lindsay because it was easier than facing the reality that mom was gone forever. As long as I could be mad at Lindsay for removing mom's things, I didn't have to accept that mom was actually dead. Tabitha helped me understand that forgiving Lindsay didn't mean forgetting mom or excusing the pain. It meant releasing the resentment that was keeping me stuck in the past. She said grief was about learning to carry loss without letting it define everything. I cried harder than I had in months. Not sad tears, but relieved ones. Like I'd been holding my breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. When I left her office that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in forever. Dad came home from work 3 weeks later with news. He'd gotten promoted to senior project manager with a significant raise. He was excited but also nervous about telling us because it would mean longer hours sometimes. Lindsay told him to take the promotion. She said we needed good news and financial stability. Dad surprised us both by saying he wanted to use some of the extra money to take us on a weekend trip to the beach. Mom had always wanted to go to the ocean, but we'd never made it happen before she died. He said it was time we did something mom would have wanted. We planned the trip for the following month when Lindsay would be between treatment rounds. The drive took 4 hours and Lindsay slept most of the way. When we finally saw the ocean, she sat up and stared out the window. We checked into a small hotel right on the beach and spent the first evening walking on the sand. Lindsay was tired but determined. Dad and I walked on either side of her, ready to catch her if she stumbled. The next morning, we woke up early to watch the sunrise. Dad had brought a small container of mom's ashes that he'd kept separate from the rest. We walked out onto the beach as the sky turned pink and orange. Dad opened the container and we each took a handful of ashes. On the count of 3, we scattered them into the wind over the water. We said goodbye to the version of our family that had existed before mom died. It was sad but also freeing to acknowledge that we were different people now. That loss had changed us, but it didn't have to destroy us. We stood there watching the waves for a long time. 3 people who'd been broken and were slowly learning how to be whole again. 2 weeks later, Lindsay felt good enough to drive. She suggested we go shopping for college stuff, and I agreed because I wanted to spend time with her while she had energy. We went to 3 different stores looking at bedding and decorations and random stuff I didn't even know I needed. Lindsay picked out a comforter set with blue and gray stripes that she said would work in any dorm room. I grabbed some desk organizers and a lamp that could clip onto my bed frame. We filled the cart with towels and hangers and a small rug. At the checkout, Lindsay watched me load everything onto the belt and got this look on her face like she might cry. She told me she was proud of the person I was becoming. She said mom would be proud too. I told her I was grateful she kept her promise to mom even though the path was messier than anyone expected. She squeezed my hand and said, "Mess was part of being human." We loaded everything into her car and drove home talking about what classes I might take first semester. The next week, Tabitha asked if I wanted to start volunteering with her grief support group. She said hearing from someone closer to their age might help the teenagers who came to sessions. I was nervous, but I agreed because I wanted to do something meaningful with what I'd learned. The first session, I sat in the circle with 6 kids between 14 and 18. They all stared at me, waiting for me to say something important. I told them about mom dying and how angry I was at Lindsay for trying to erase her. I explained how I almost destroyed Lindsay's car before finding out the truth about everything. One girl asked if I still got mad sometimes, and I said yes because grief doesn't just disappear. A boy asked how I forgave Lindsay, and I told him it happened slowly through therapy and honest conversations. After the session, 3 kids came up to thank me for being real about how hard it was. The next week, Lindsay came to talk about being a patient and a survivor. She didn't sugarcoat anything about how scary cancer was, or how unfair it felt to watch people die. The kids asked her questions about treatment and pain, and whether she was afraid of dying. She answered everything honestly, and I saw them relax because she wasn't treating them like they were too young to handle the truth. Our family therapy with Kayla started feeling different around this time. We weren't in crisis mode anymore, trying to fix everything that was broken. Instead, we talked about how to handle future problems, and how to communicate when things got hard. Kayla asked us what we'd do if Lindsay's cancer got worse, or if I struggled at college, or if Dad felt overwhelmed. We practiced having difficult conversations without shutting down or getting defensive. Kayla told us she was impressed by how far we'd come in just a few months. She said most families never did the work we were doing, and that our willingness to try was what made the difference. Dad said therapy was harder than he expected, but worth it. Lindsay agreed and added that she wished she'd started years ago before her trauma got so out of control. I told them I was grateful we were all trying, even when it sucked. One evening after dinner, I asked Dad to sit with me on the back porch. I needed to say something I'd been holding on to for too long. I told him I understood his grief after Mom died, but his silence hurt me almost as much as Lindsay's actions did. I explained that every time he stayed quiet when Lindsay removed Mom's things or banned her name, it felt like he was choosing Lindsay over Mom's memory. He sat there for a long time not saying anything, and I thought he might get defensive. Instead, he apologized and said he knew he'd been a coward. He told me he was so scared of falling apart that he let Lindsay make all the hard decisions. He said he should have protected me better and been more present. He promised to do better going forward, and I told him I could see he was trying through his therapy and how he communicated now. We sat there watching the sun go down, and I felt like I finally had my dad back after losing him for 2 years. Lindsay's next scan results came back showing continued stability. Dr. Owens called it cautiously good news and said the modified treatment protocol seemed to be working. He explained that stage 4 cancer was unpredictable, but if things stayed controlled, she might have more time than initially expected. Maybe even years if we were lucky. Lindsay cried when he said that, and so did Dad, and so did I. We didn't want to get our hopes up too high, but we let ourselves hope a little bit for the first time since her cancer came back. Dr. Owens reminded us to take things one scan at a time and not borrow worry from the future. Lindsay said she was grateful for every good day she got, and that was enough for now. 3 weeks later, I got my college acceptance letters. 3 schools said yes, including the one across the country that I'd called my dream school since sophomore year. Dad and Lindsay were excited and started talking about plane tickets and move-in dates. I told them I'd chosen the school that was only 2 hours away instead. Lindsay immediately said I should go to my dream school and not limit myself because of her health. I explained that being close to family was my dream now, and I didn't want to miss appointments or important moments. We went back and forth about it until we compromised that I'd study abroad junior year if she was still stable. She made me promise I wouldn't give up opportunities because of her, and I made her promise to tell me if she got worse. Dad hugged both of us and said he was proud of the women we'd become. We planned a celebration dinner for my college acceptance and invited Mila, Austin, Kayla, and Tabitha. Lindsay insisted on cooking even though she was tired from treatment. She made Mom's lasagna recipe and a salad and garlic bread. Everyone showed up with cards and small gifts, and the house felt full of people who cared about us. After dinner, Lindsay stood up and gave a speech about how proud she was to be my stepmother. She said she was grateful I gave her a second chance when she didn't deserve it. She thanked everyone for supporting our family through the hardest months. I stood up and responded by saying she earned that second chance by being willing to change and grow. I told everyone that's what family does. They show up and they try to forgive when it's hard. Mila was crying, and so was Kayla. Austin raised his glass and said, "Here's to families that choose each other every day." The next week, Dad and Lindsay asked me to sit down for an important conversation. They said they'd been working with a lawyer to make sure I was protected financially no matter what happened with Lindsay's health. They'd set up a trust fund using the watch money plus additional savings they'd been putting away. They wanted me to know I'd be okay even if the worst happened. They showed me all the paperwork and explained how everything worked. I was touched by their planning, but mostly grateful that we could talk about difficult things now without secrets. Lindsay said she needed to know I'd be taken care of if she wasn't around. I told her I'd rather have her than any amount of money, but I appreciated what they were doing. Dad said planning for bad outcomes didn't mean we expected them, but we wanted to be prepared. A few days later, the 3 of us drove to the cemetery together. It was the first time we'd all gone to Mom's grave as a family. We brought flowers and gardening tools and spent an hour planting them around her headstone. Lindsay chose purple irises because they were Mom's favorite. Dad picked yellow roses because Mom loved bright colors. I added white daisies because they reminded me of Mom's garden. When we finished, we sat on the grass and each shared what we'd learned over the past few months. Lindsay thanked Mom for bringing us together and promised to keep trying to be the person Mom believed she could be. Dad promised to honor Mom by being present and honest instead of hiding from hard emotions. I promised to live fully and love openly the way Mom wanted. We sat there for a long time not saying anything, just being together in a place that connected us all to Mom. Move-in day arrived faster than I expected. Dad and Lindsay both came to help me set up my dorm room. Lindsay was tired from treatment, but she insisted on being there. She helped me make the bed and arrange my desk and hang up clothes. Dad assembled the small bookshelf I'd bought and organized my textbooks. I hung photos on the wall above my desk, including pictures of Mom and newer photos of our blended family. Lindsay saw them and started crying. She told me she loved me for the first time, and I realized I loved her too. Not as a replacement for Mom, but as her own person who'd become important to me. She was part of my family now in a way that felt real and earned. Dad hugged both of us and said Mom would be happy to see us together like this. We finished setting up the room and then went to lunch at a diner near campus. Lindsay was exhausted by the time we got back to the car, but she smiled the whole drive home. 3 weeks later, I sat in the waiting room at the cancer center while Lindsay finished her scan. Dad paced near the window, checking his phone every few seconds even though we both knew the doctor wouldn't call until Lindsay was done. I twisted the replica watch around my wrist, a habit I'd developed since putting it on that first day at the hospital. The waiting room had become familiar over the past months, with its pale blue walls and magazines nobody ever read. I knew which chairs had the best view of the hallway, which vending machine actually worked, and exactly how long it took for scan results to come back. Lindsay emerged from the imaging area looking tired but steady, and we walked together to Owens's office for the results. He pulled up the scans on his computer screen and pointed to the areas that had been lighting up with cancer activity months ago. The tumors were stable, some even slightly smaller than before. He used the word remission carefully, explaining that stage 4 cancer could change without warning, and there were no promises about tomorrow. But today was good news, and we decided to celebrate that instead of worrying about what might happen next. Lindsay reached for both our hands and said something that stuck with me. She said surviving wasn't just about staying alive, but about living with purpose and connection, and she was finally doing both. We went out for ice cream after the appointment, something we'd started doing after good scan results, and talked about my upcoming semester and Dad's new project at work. 6 months after that phone call in the hospital parking lot, I'm in my dorm room texting with Lindsay about my psychology class. She wants to know everything about the grief counseling unit we're studying, and I tell her about the theories that actually match what our family went through. My phone buzzes with a photo from Dad showing him and Lindsay in the kitchen making Sunday dinner together, both of them smiling at the camera with flour on their faces. Our family isn't perfect, and we still have hard days when Lindsay feels sick, or I miss Mom so much it hurts. But we're honest with each other now, and that makes the hard days easier to handle. I look at the replica watch on my wrist and think about the original heirloom sitting in Lindsay's father's collection. Sometimes I wonder if I should have fought harder to keep it, but then I remember the college fund, and the storage unit full of Mom's things and all the ways Lindsay tried to keep her promise even when it looked like she was breaking it. I think about that night when my friends were waiting at my house with eggs and supplies to destroy her car. I was so close to doing something I could never take back, so sure I understood everything when I actually understood nothing. Mom was right about Lindsay being strong enough to help us survive the loss, and I'm grateful I was strong enough to let her try.